They laughed before the blade even started spinning. Not nervous laughter. Not awkward laughter. The kind that comes sharp and confident. The kind that assumes it already knows the ending. The sound echoed inside the test hangar, bouncing off steel beams and polished concrete, mixing with the low hum of generators and the distant whine of hydraulic pumps. Phones were already out. Someone whispered, "This is going to be good," like they were settling in for entertainment, not watching a man get humiliated at his job. At the center of it all stood Margaret Collins, 43. Tailored charcoal suit, hair pulled back tight enough to broadcast authority from 50 feet away. She didn't raise her voice. She never had to. The room leaned toward her instinctively. Engineers in flight jackets, executives with folded arms, contractors pretending not to listen while listening anyway. And beside the helicopter, half hidden by its dark fuselage, stood the janitor. His name badge read Daniel Harris, but nobody said it. Nobody ever did. To them, he was just the man with the floor buffer and the cart that squeaked when it turned too fast. Late 50s, broad shoulders softened by time, work boots scuffed and honest, hands rough, steady, holding a rag against the cockpit glass, like it mattered more than whatever meeting was happening behind him. Margaret glanced at him, the way people glance at a clock they plan to ignore. Then she smiled. "If you think you know so much," she said, voice light, almost playful. "Fly the helicopter. I'll even take you to dinner." The laugh came hard after that. A ripple, then a wave. Someone near the back clapped once before realizing nobody else was clapping and stopping mid-motion. A young engineer nudged another and muttered something about reality television. The security supervisor shifted his weight, uncomfortable eyes flicking between Margaret and the janitor like he was watching a line get crossed, but wasn't sure who had crossed it. Daniel Harris did not laugh. He didn't stiffen either. No flare of anger, no wounded pride. He finished wiping the glass, folded the rag once, twice, placed it back on the cart with care. Only then did he turn. Up close, his face told a different story than his uniform. Not soft, not dull. The eyes were alert, old alert. The kind that had learned long ago how to watch a room without being seen doing it. "I didn't say I knew more," he said. His voice was low, calm, carrying farther than it should have. "I said you were missing something." That earned another laugh, shorter this time. Less confident. Margaret tilted her head. A small gesture, but sharp. Appraisal. She was used to men pushing back, used to shutting them down faster. This one didn't sound defensive. That irritated her more than arrogance ever did. "And what exactly are we missing?" she asked. Daniel looked past her at the helicopter. The aircraft sat under the hangar lights like a sleeping animal. Matte black, clean lines, a civilian prototype built for corporate rescue contracts and emergency transport, not show. The kind of machine that had already eaten $4.7 million in delays and internal arguments. "No one in that room wants to be the first person to trust it," Daniel said. The air shifted. A senior engineer named Paul Granger cleared his throat. He was in his early 60s, grey at the temples, hands clasped behind his back. He'd been silent all morning. He didn't like this conversation, not because Daniel was wrong, but because Daniel was saying it out loud. "That's not fair," Paul said carefully. This isn't about courage. It's about compliance. FAA protocol. Liability. Daniel nodded once. Respectful. It always is. Margaret's smile tightened. She hated when conversations drifted out of her control. Hated when the wrong people sounded reasonable. Let's be clear, she said. You are part of the maintenance crew. You're not cleared for flight operations. You don't attend these meetings. You overheard something and decided to make it philosophical. I overhear a lot, Daniel replied. When you're invisible, people forget to lower their voices. That landed harder than he intended, or maybe exactly as hard. A few heads turned. One of the younger engineers stared at the floor. The security supervisor exhaled slowly through his nose. Margaret took a step closer. You're out of line, she said. Not angry, worse, controlled. This aircraft represents 3 years of work and millions of dollars. You don't get to reduce that to a metaphor because you're bored on a mop shift. Daniel met her gaze, didn't flinch. I get bored, he said. I don't get careless. Silence stretched. Thick. The helicopter's cooling fans clicked as metal contracted. Somewhere, a door slammed. The world kept moving while this room held its breath. Margaret could have ended it there. She should have. That was the smart move. The CEO move. Instead, she heard herself say, "So what would you do?" The question surprised even her. Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes traced the length of the rotor mast, the angle of the tail boom, the way the landing skids sat just slightly uneven on the floor. I'd stop asking for volunteers, he said. And I'd stop pretending the risk is theoretical. Paul Granger frowned. That's exactly why we're cautious. Daniel turned to him. No, he said gently. That's why you're stuck. The words were quiet, but they cut. Margaret felt it then. Not fear. Something worse. Doubt. Not about the helicopter. About herself. About the fact that a man she'd written off had just named the problem she'd been dancing around for weeks. She covered it fast. Well, she said, folding her arms. Since you seem so confident, what would you suggest? Hypothetically. Daniel looked at her. Really looked at her now. Not the suit, not the title. The tension in her jaw. The exhaustion behind her eyes. The pressure she hadn't voiced, but everyone felt. I'd start with the data everyone else is too scared to touch, he said. And I'd stop letting fear dress itself up as procedure. Someone muttered, Jesus. Margaret's phone buzzed in her hand. She ignored it. Her pulse had picked up, and she didn't like that either. And the flying part, she asked. Daniel's mouth curved just barely. Not a smile. Recognition. That part comes later, he said. The room reacted to that. Murmurs, a shift in posture. The laughter didn't come back this time. Margaret stared at him, measuring. She had built her career on reading people on spotting bluff from 50 yards away. This wasn't bluff. This was something older, heavier. She gestured toward the helicopter, sharp, decisive. You think you understand this machine better than the people who built it? She asked. Daniel shook his head. No. I think I understand what happens when good machines meet bad decisions. The security supervisor took a step forward. "Ma'am," he said quietly. "We should probably—" "Not yet," Margaret said. She didn't take her eyes off Daniel. "If I asked you to prove it," she said, "what would you do?" The hangar seemed to lean in. Daniel looked down at his hands, at the cracks in his knuckles, the scars he never talked about. When he looked back up, his voice was steady. "I'd ask you to stop joking," he said, "because what comes next isn't funny." No one laughed. Not this time. Margaret felt the weight of every eye in the room shift back onto her. CEO, decision maker, woman who did not retreat. She straightened. "Then let's see where this goes," she said. And somewhere deep beneath the polished floor and practiced confidence, something old and dangerous stirred. No one moved after that. The hangar held its breath the way a courtroom does right before a verdict, heavy and expectant. Margaret Collins felt it in the tightness behind her eyes, the faint pressure at the base of her skull that always appeared when control started slipping. Not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough to be dangerous. Her phone buzzed again. She ignored it. Paul Granger broke first. He shifted his stance, clasped his hands tighter behind his back, and cleared his throat in the careful way men used when they were about to say something reasonable that would still upset someone powerful. With respect, he said, choosing every word like a step across ice, "This conversation is drifting away from protocol." Daniel Harris didn't look at him. His attention was on the helicopter, on the faint vibration still running through its frame from the earlier systems test, on the way the aircraft seemed less like an object and more like a waiting thing. Margaret turned to Paul. "Is he wrong?" Paul hesitated. That pause was everything. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. 2 seconds too long. I didn't say that, Paul replied. I said this isn't how decisions get made. Daniel finally looked back at them. Decisions get made when someone accepts responsibility, he said. Everything else is paperwork catching up later. A younger engineer near the avionics console swallowed hard. His name was Ethan Morales, early 30s, smart, careful. The kind of man who triple-checked his work because he'd grown up watching his father lose a job over a mistake that wasn't entirely his fault. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, then spoke anyway. If something goes wrong, he said quietly, people don't blame the machine. They blame the last person who signed off. Daniel nodded. That's true, Ethan frowned. Then why would anyone volunteer? Daniel's eyes softened just a fraction. Because sometimes, he said, you're not volunteering for glory. You're volunteering so the wrong person doesn't pay the price later. That landed differently. Margaret saw it ripple through the room. Engineers shifted. A contractor near the back crossed his arms tighter. The security supervisor glanced at the exits, then back again, like he was watching something escalate without knowing which rule applied. Margaret stepped forward, heels clicking once against the concrete. The sound cut through the air like a gavel. Enough, she said. Not loud. Final. She turned to Daniel. You've made your point, but don't confuse observation with authority. This is my operation, my liability, my name on the line. Daniel didn't argue that. He inclined his head slightly. I know. The simplicity of it irritated her more than defiance would have. You don't know what pressures are sitting on this project, she continued. You don't see the contracts, the board calls, the deadlines that don't care about ideals. Daniel met her gaze steadily. I know what it's like to be responsible for people you can't afford to fail. The words carried weight, not metaphorical weight. Lived in weight. Margaret felt a flicker of something she didn't want to name. She pushed past it. You want to help, she said. Fine. Then start by telling me something useful. Something no one else in this room has already said. Daniel didn't respond right away. He walked instead. Slow, measured steps toward the helicopter. The room watched him go, uncertain whether to stop him. He didn't touch the aircraft at first. He crouched near the left landing skid, resting his weight on the balls of his feet, like his body remembered something before his mind did. He pointed. That strut, he said. It's compensating too aggressively. Paul frowned. We accounted for, I know you did. Daniel interrupted, not unkindly. You accounted for weight distribution on paper, but not human hesitation. In real flight, pilots hesitate when systems feel too perfect. They overcorrect. That strut is going to amplify that instinct. Ethan stepped closer despite himself. How would you even know that without flying it? Daniel looked up at him. Because I've watched good pilots fight machines that were smarter than they trusted. Margaret felt the room tilt again. This wasn't bravado. This was pattern recognition. She hated that she recognized it. Paul rubbed his jaw. We can run another simulation. Daniel stood. You already did. It told you what you wanted to hear. Silence. Margaret's phone buzzed a third time. She glanced at it this time. The caller ID read, Board Liaison. She exhaled slowly and declined the call. When did you last fly? She asked suddenly. Daniel didn't flinch. 14 years ago. That got a reaction, a sharp intake of breath from someone near the back. Ethan's eyebrows shot up. Paul's expression hardened. Margaret seized it. 14 years, she repeated. Then let's not pretend you're current. I didn't say I was, Daniel replied. I said I know what breaks first. Margaret stared at him. You're asking me to trust instinct over certification. No, Daniel said. I'm asking you to stop pretending they're enemies. She turned away from him, pacing now. 1 step. 2. 3. The hangar lights reflected off the helicopter's canopy, throwing warped versions of her face back at her. CEO. Daughter of a machinist who'd taught her to respect tools. A woman who had clawed her way up rooms just like this one. You think I enjoy delaying this? She asked, not looking at him. You think I like standing in front of a board, explaining why brilliant people are afraid to do their jobs? Daniel's voice was quiet. I think you're afraid of being the only one blamed when something goes wrong. That stopped her cold. She turned back. Slowly. The room had gone so still she could hear the faint tick of cooling metal again. Careful, she said. Daniel didn't back down. I am. Paul stepped in quickly. Margaret, he said we can table this. Take it offline. There's no reason to. There is. She cut in. She looked at Daniel. Really looked. The lines around his eyes. the way he held himself like someone used to weight on his shoulders. Not importance. Consequence. You keep talking like you've already paid for mistakes, she said. What happened? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Daniel hesitated. Just a beat. Long enough to matter. I buried people who trusted my judgment, he said, and I lived. No one spoke after that. Margaret felt something settle in her chest. Not sympathy. Respect. The kind that didn't ask permission. She exhaled slowly. You don't get to fly, she said finally. Not today. Not like this. Paul relaxed visibly. Ethan sagged a fraction. Daniel nodded. I didn't expect to. But Margaret continued raising a hand. You don't go back to pushing a mop either. Daniel looked at her surprised despite himself. You sit in on the review, she said. All of it. You tell us where you think we're lying to ourselves. No decisions, no signatures, just truth. Paul stiffened. Margaret. I said truth, she snapped. We can handle it. Daniel studied her face. Something unreadable passed through his eyes. Then he nodded. All right. Margaret turned to the room. Clear the floor. We start over. As people began to move reluctantly, unsettled, the security supervisor lingered near Daniel. Sir, he said quietly, you're not cleared. Pas Margaret didn't even turn. He is now. Daniel watched the helicopter as the hangar slowly emptied. The machine waited. Patient, dangerous, honest in the way machines always were. Margaret stood beside him, arms folded, jaw tight. You haven't told me everything, she said. Daniel's gaze didn't leave the aircraft. Neither have you. For the first time since she'd taken the job, Margaret Collins didn't argue. The review room smelled like burnt coffee and stale ambition. Margaret Collins noticed it the moment the door sealed behind them, the soft hiss of the hydraulic lock cutting off the hangar's vast openness. This room was smaller, windowless, designed for decisions that couldn't afford witnesses. A long table sat at the center, scarred by years of binders dragged across its surface. Screens lined one wall, dark for now, waiting. Daniel Harris took the chair farthest from the head of the table without being told. Not submissive. Strategic. He placed his hands flat on the wood fingers, spread, grounding himself. The habit was old. He didn't look at Margaret when she sat opposite him, nor at Paul Granger as he settled beside her, shoulders tight. Ethan Morales hovered for a moment before choosing a seat near the screens. He kept glancing at Daniel, curiosity wrestling with anxiety. This wasn't where janitors sat. Everyone in the room knew that. Margaret tapped the tablet in front of her. The screens flickered to life, filling with diagrams, telemetry graphs, failure trees. She took a breath, steadying the room without raising her voice. We're off record, she said. No minutes, no recording. What's said here stays here. Paul frowned. That's highly irregular. So is being stuck, Margaret replied. Proceed. The lead systems engineer began his presentation, voice practiced, confident. Redundancy layers, safety margins, fail-safes stacked on fail-safes. Daniel listened without interruption, eyes following the lines on the screen, tracking patterns most people missed, because they trusted the labels too much. 10 minutes in, Margaret noticed something else. Daniel wasn't nodding. He wasn't frowning either. He was waiting. When the engineer finished, Paul turned slightly toward Daniel. "All right," he said. "Professional, guarded. You've been quiet." Daniel leaned back, chair creaking softly. "You're optimizing for a perfect pilot," he said. The engineer bristled. "We're optimizing for trained professionals." "Same assumption," Daniel replied. "Different language." Ethan spoke up before Paul could. "The system compensates for human error." Daniel looked at him. "It compensates for known error. Not panic, not second-guessing. Not the moment when a pilot realizes the machine is making a decision faster than they can understand it." Margaret felt a chill. "Go on. You've built something that behaves beautifully until it doesn't," Daniel said. "And when it crosses that threshold, it will do so cleanly, quietly. No warning spike, no dramatic failure. Just a subtle lag between intent and response." Paul crossed his arms. "That's speculation." Daniel nodded. "It always is, until it isn't." Margaret turned to the screen. "Can you show us?" Daniel stood. No permission asked. He moved to the console with the ease of someone who'd stood in rooms like this long before anyone here had learned the language. He didn't touch anything yet. He pointed. "Here," he said. "This loop. You've weighted it to trust sensor fusion over pilot input during transitional states." The engineer hesitated. "That's standard." Daniel looked back at Margaret. "Standard kills people when conditions aren't." Silence thickened again. Margaret's phone buzzed on the table. She didn't look this time. "Paul," she said, "run the scenario he's pointing at." Paul hesitated, then nodded to Ethan. "Do it." The simulation began. Numbers danced. The helicopter silhouette on the screen lifted, banked corrected. Everything looked smooth, clean. Right. Daniel waited. "Pause," he said. Ethan froze the frame. "What are we looking for?" Daniel stepped closer. "That delay," he said. 0.3 of a second. You'll never notice it in calm conditions. But add wind shear. Add low visibility. Add a pilot who's already tense because this is a prototype and everyone's watching. Paul's jaw tightened. 0.3 isn't catastrophic. "No," Daniel said. "It's deceptive." Margaret leaned forward. "Explain." "Pilots compensate instinctively," Daniel said. "When response lags, they input more. The system corrects harder. Now you've got a feedback loop. Not violent, not dramatic, just wrong." Ethan stared at the screen. Color draining from his face. "We didn't see this in testing." Daniel met his eyes. "Because no one wanted to." That wasn't accusation. It was fact. Margaret exhaled slowly. "If you're right," she said, "then flying this thing without addressing it puts someone at risk." Daniel nodded once. "Yes." "And if you're wrong," Paul added sharply, "we delay another quarter and bleed money we don't have." Daniel didn't argue. "Also, yes." Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment. Images flashed uninvited. Board members, headlines, the quiet dread of knowing she'd signed something irreversible. She opened her eyes and fixed them on Daniel. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Really?" The room went still. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands again. The scars, the faint tremor in his left fingers when he held them too still. "Because I've watched people pay for shortcuts they didn't know they were taking," he said. "And because I can't watch it happen again." Paul studied him carefully. "You said you buried people." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I said I lived." Margaret felt the weight of that settle differently now. Not as a story, as a warning. Her phone buzzed again. She picked it up this time. "Board liaison." She let it ring. Then she turned the screen face down. "We adjust the loop," she said. Paul blinked. "Margaret." "We adjust it," she repeated. "We slow the response. We give the pilot back authority during transitions. That violates our initial performance targets," Paul said. "Then we revise the targets," Margaret replied. "I won't put my name on a machine that outpaces human judgment." The room reacted in fragments. Relief, fear, something like respect. Ethan swallowed. "It'll take weeks." "So be it." Paul leaned back, rubbing his temples. "The board will lose their minds." Margaret looked at Daniel. "Will it work?" Daniel considered. "It'll be safer." "That's not the same as perfect." "I'll take safer," she said. The meeting broke soon after, not with consensus, but with momentum. Engineers left in clusters, voices low urgent. Ethan lingered, staring at the frozen simulation like it had betrayed him personally. When the room finally emptied, it was just Margaret and Daniel again. She stood by the screen, arms folded, watching the paused helicopter hover in digital limbo. "You could have stayed invisible," she said. "Why didn't you?" Daniel joined her, standing a respectful distance away. "Because invisible people see what visible ones miss," he said. "And sometimes that's a burden." Margaret nodded slowly. "You realize what you've done?" "Yes." "You've made enemies?" "Yes. And you haven't even told me who you really are." Daniel looked at the screen. The helicopter. The machine that hadn't flown yet, but already carried the weight of too many decisions. "I'm someone who knows what happens when leadership waits too long," he said, "and someone who doesn't plan to be quiet about it anymore." Margaret studied his reflection in the dark screen. For the first time, she wondered not what he'd been, but what he still was. Outside the room, the hangar lights dimmed as night crept in. The helicopter waited in the dark, unfinished in ways no blueprint could show. And Margaret Collins understood with a clarity that unsettled her that the most dangerous part of the project had never been the machine. The call came at 6:17 in the evening, just as the hangar lights shifted to night mode. Margaret Collins was halfway down the corridor when her phone vibrated in her palm, a sharp, insistent buzz that felt heavier than the others had. She stopped walking. The hallway smelled faintly of oil and recycled air, the kind of smell that clung to places where work never really ended. She looked at the screen. Board liaison. Again. She didn't answer. She slid the phone into her jacket pocket and kept walking. Behind her, Daniel Harris moved at a slower pace, his cart rolling quietly beside him, mop bucket half full, like the day had never changed at all. He watched her shoulders as she walked. Tension sat there, tight and precise. He recognized it. The posture of someone preparing for a fight they didn't want, but couldn't avoid. They reached the hangar floor together. The helicopter sat in the center floodlit, now shadows, stretching long and theatrical across the concrete. Technicians were packing up for the night. Tools clinked. Laughter rose briefly, then fell. People glanced at Margaret and Daniel in quick, curious flashes before looking away. Margaret stopped beside the aircraft and turned to him. "You should go home," she said. Daniel rested both hands on the handle of the cart. "I will." That wasn't a suggestion. "I know." She studied him. He wasn't pushing. He never did. That made it harder. "The board knows something's wrong," she said. "They don't know what yet, but they feel it." Daniel nodded. "They always do. They think I'm stalling." "You are." Margaret exhaled sharply. "I'm preventing a disaster. Same thing to people who don't have to live with the outcome." She looked away, jaw tight. "You didn't have to put me in this position." Daniel's voice was steady. "You were already in it. You just didn't want to see it yet." Her phone vibrated again. This time she took it out and answered. "Yes," she said. "I'm aware." A pause. Her expression hardened. "No. We are not proceeding under the original timeline." Another pause. "Longer." "Because I won't." Her voice dropped. "If that's unacceptable, we can discuss leadership transitions at the next meeting." She ended the call without waiting for a response. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The helicopter's fuselage ticked softly as it cooled metal settling like bones after a long day. "You just picked a fight," Daniel said quietly. Margaret slipped the phone back into her pocket. "I picked a line." He studied her profile. "You'll lose sleep over that." "I already do." A voice cut in from behind them. "Margaret." Paul Granger stood a few yards away, jacket on briefcase in hand. His face was pale in the hangar lights, the lines deeper than they'd been that morning. He looked older tonight. "I need a word," he said. Margaret nodded once. "Go ahead." Paul's eyes flicked to Daniel. "Alone." Daniel didn't move. Margaret didn't either. "He stays," she said. Paul swallowed whatever he'd been about to say. "The board is convening an emergency call," he said. "Tonight. They want answers, names. They want to know who's influencing this shift." Margaret's mouth curved, humorless. "They can start with me." Paul hesitated. "They won't stop there." Daniel met Paul's gaze calmly. "You think this is about me?" I think Paul said carefully that people get nervous when control moves off the org chart. Daniel nodded. "It usually does." Paul turned back to Margaret. "You're risking more than the project. I know exactly what I'm risking." Paul studied her for a long moment. "Do you?" She didn't answer. Paul sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You need to understand something," he said. "This company has survived because it's predictable, because it doesn't surprise its investors." Margaret looked past him at the helicopter. "Then it's been surviving on borrowed time." Paul's jaw tightened. "You're letting sentiment cloud judgment." Daniel spoke before Margaret could. "You're mistaking accountability for sentiment." Paul's eyes flashed. "Stay out of this." Daniel didn't raise his voice. "I am in this, whether you like it or not." Paul looked at Margaret. "You trust him?" Margaret hesitated. "Just a fraction. Long enough for Daniel to see it. Long enough for Paul to latch onto it." "I trust what he sees," she said finally. "And I trust myself to decide what to do with it." Paul exhaled slowly. "That may not be enough. It will have to be." Paul nodded once, defeated, or resolved, it was hard to tell. "Good luck tonight," he said, and walked away without another word. The hangar emptied quickly after that. Lights dimmed. The space grew cavernous, echoing. Somewhere outside, wind rattled a loose panel. Daniel finished mopping a section of floor that didn't need it more out of habit than necessity. Margaret watched him work. "You don't have to do that anymore," she said. Daniel wrung out the mop with deliberate care. "Someone does." She considered that. "You're not who you pretend to be." Daniel smiled faintly. "Neither are you." Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the time. 7:02 in the evening. The board call would start in 8 minutes. "I should go," she said. Daniel nodded. "They'll push you." "I know. They'll ask for proof." "I have it. They'll ask for a scapegoat." Margaret met his eyes. "They won't get at one." Daniel studied her face, searching for cracks. He didn't find any. Just resolve. Hard-earned and brittle. "You realize," he said, "that once this starts, there's no going back to before." She smiled, thin and tired. There was never a before. There was only delay. She turned to leave, then stopped. "Daniel." "Yes." "What really happened?" she asked, "the day you buried those people?" He didn't answer right away. The hangar felt enormous around them, empty and listening. "I trusted a system that hadn't earned it," he said finally, "and I didn't question it fast enough." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then we won't make that mistake." She walked away, footsteps echoing into the distance. Daniel stood alone with the helicopter. He rested a hand against its side, feeling the cold metal under his palm. The machine didn't lie. It never did. People did that part on their own. High above, the hangar doors loomed like a threshold. Somewhere beyond them, decisions were already being made, alliances shifting, narratives forming without his consent. Daniel picked up his cart and pushed it toward the exit. The wheels whispering across the floor. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He felt exposed, and that he knew was always the moment before everything changed. The board call began without pleasantries. Margaret Collins sat alone in her office lights, dimmed jacket, draped over the chair behind her, sleeves rolled just enough to remind herself she was still human. The screen in front of her filled with faces as they connected one by one, men and women, framed by bookshelves, city skylines, carefully curated authority. No one smiled. "Let's get to it," said Richard. Hale. 71, chairman of the board. His voice gravelly and unimpressed. "We were informed you halted the timeline again." "I adjusted it," Margaret said. "For safety." A murmur rippled across the grid of faces. Someone muted themselves too late. Someone else leaned back, arms crossed. "You've been in this role less than a year," Richard continued. "And already you're asking us to absorb more delay." Margaret held his gaze through the camera. "I'm asking you to absorb reality." "Reality," another board member echoed dry. "Is that our competitors are moving?" "So are funerals," Margaret replied. The words surprised even her. She didn't apologize. Silence fell. Heavy, judgmental. Richard's eyes narrowed. "You're emotional." "No," she said. "I'm accountable." A woman in a cream blazer leaned forward. "We've reviewed the technical brief you sent. It's unconventional. It's accurate." According to whom Margaret didn't hesitate. According to someone who's seen what happens when machines outpace human trust. And who would that be, Richard asked. Margaret paused. She could feel the moment stretching, tightening around her, like wire. "An internal consultant," she said. "Brought in temporarily." "Name him." She exhaled slowly. "Daniel Harris." A few faces shifted. Brows furrowed. One man frowned at his notes. "Isn't that a maintenance contractor?" someone asked. "Yes." A scoff. "You're basing strategic decisions on a janitor's opinion." Margaret leaned closer to the camera. "I'm basing them on experience you don't have." Richard's jaw set. "This is not how governance works." "This," Margaret replied, "is how leadership works, when governance gets comfortable." The screen erupted, overlapping voices, objections, warnings. The word liability surfaced more than once. Margaret let them speak. She waited. When the noise crested, she raised her hand. "You asked me to take this company forward," she said. "Not preserve your comfort. If you want someone who won't challenge you, replace me. But if you want an aircraft that doesn't kill its pilot, you give me time." Richard studied her. Long. Cold. "You're staking your career on this." Margaret didn't look away. "I already have." The call ended without resolution. No vote, no reassurance, just a promise of follow-up and the unspoken threat that came with it. Margaret closed the laptop and sat back, heart pounding now that the room was empty. She pressed her fingers to her temples and let herself breathe. Just once. Across the facility, Daniel Harris sat at a small kitchen table in a modest rental house, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. Emily sat across from him, math book, open pencil, tapping a nervous rhythm against the page. "You're late," she said, not accusing. "Observant. I know," Daniel replied. "Sorry." She studied his face the way only children could. "You're thinking loud." He smiled faintly. "Am I?" "You do that when something's about to change." Daniel leaned back in his chair. The ceiling fan spun lazily overhead shadows, tracing slow circles. "You remember what I told you about storms?" Emily nodded. "You don't stop them. You read them." "That's right." She chewed on that. "Is there a storm now?" Daniel hesitated. "Maybe." Emily closed her book. "Then don't pretend it's sunny." The honesty hit him harder than any boardroom confrontation. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I won't." Back at the facility, night security made their rounds. Footsteps echoed. Doors clicked. The helicopter sat alone under its lights, unchanged but no longer innocent. Cameras watched. Systems slept lightly. In a small office near the hangar floor, Paul Granger stared at his screen, jaw clenched. An email glowed back at him unsent. He reread it for the 5th time. Subject Risk Assessment Addendum. He exhaled and hit send. The message went not to Margaret, but to the board. By morning, the facility buzzed with a different energy. Whispers moved faster than forklifts. People glanced toward Daniel as he passed, curiosity sharpening into something like recognition. Someone nodded at him. Someone else looked away. Margaret arrived early. Coffee untouched on her desk. Her inbox was full. Requests, concerns, a calendar invite labeled Emergency Review. She stood and walked to the hangar instead. Daniel was already there, cart parked neatly by the wall, eyes on the helicopter, like it might speak if he listened long enough. "They're circling," Margaret said, stopping beside him. Daniel nodded. "They always do before they strike. You think Paul?" "He's afraid," Daniel said. "Fear makes people choose sides." Margaret folded her arms. "I need leverage." Daniel considered. "Then stop playing defense." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means you show them what they're really afraid of," he said. "Not delay, not cost, consequence." Margaret's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. An alert. "Compliance review. Scheduled. Today. 10:30. They're bringing regulators," she said. Daniel's gaze sharpened. "Then it's already bigger than you." Margaret's pulse quickened. "If they ground the project." "They won't," Daniel said. "Not if you tell the truth first." She looked at him, searching. "You're sure Daniel met her eyes?" "I've been sure about worse." The compliance team arrived like a weather front. Suits, badges, clipboards, polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They asked questions. They asked for data. They asked for names. Margaret answered everything. Calm, precise. She didn't deflect. She didn't protect anyone but the truth. When they asked about Daniel, she didn't hesitate. "He's the reason we caught a flaw before it became a statistic," she said. One of the regulators raised an eyebrow. "And his qualifications." Daniel stepped forward. "Expired," he said. "But my judgment isn't." The room stilled. Margaret felt the risk spike, sharp and electric. Daniel continued, voice steady. "I won't fly your aircraft. I won't sign anything. But I won't let someone else die because you were in a hurry." The regulator studied him. Long. Then nodded once. That he said is not something we hear often. By afternoon, word had spread. Not the whole story. Never the whole story. But enough. The board reconvened in whispers. Paul avoided Margaret's eyes. Ethan worked through lunch, recalculating loops with a focus that bordered on obsession. As the sun dipped low, painting the hangar gold, Margaret stood beside Daniel again. "They're not done," she said. "No," Daniel agreed. "But neither are you." She looked at the helicopter, then at him. "I don't know how this ends." Daniel smiled, not kindly, not cruelly. "Honestly, neither do I." Above them the lights hummed. The machine waited. And somewhere between power and principle, the story took another breath, gathering force. Morning came with paperwork, stacks of it. Forms slid under doors. Emails flagged urgent. Margaret Collins stood at her office window watching the parking lot fill the slow choreography of a company pretending nothing had changed. She could feel the pressure building behind her ribs, the familiar squeeze of responsibility that no amount of authority ever loosened. Down on the hangar floor, Daniel Harris moved differently now. Not louder, not bolder, just less invisible. People tracked him with their eyes when they thought he wasn't looking. A technician paused to hold a door. An engineer nodded once, respectful, uncertain. Daniel acknowledged them all the same way, with a brief look and nothing more. Ethan Morales caught up to him near the tool lockers. "They're rewriting the control logic," he said, voice low. Paul's furious. Daniel kept walking. Paul's scared. Ethan hesitated. "Are you—" Daniel stopped, turned, studied the younger man's face. "Every day," he said. "Fear isn't the problem. Denial is." Ethan absorbed that, then nodded and walked away. By 10:30, the facility felt like it was holding a collective breath. The compliance review team was still on site, holed up with binders and laptops. Margaret had given them everything they asked for, and more. Transparency was her shield now. It was also her risk. The board called again, just before noon. This time, Margaret didn't wait for them to speak. "You're trying to decide whether I'm reckless or inconvenient," she said. "Let me save you the trouble. I'm both." Richard Hale's face filled her screen. Lines deepened by irritation. "You've made this personal." Margaret shook her head. "You made it political. I made it human. That's not a distinction investors appreciate." "Then investors should stop pretending they're immune to consequences." A pause. A breath. "We're sending an external audit team," Richard said. "Independent. They'll evaluate the aircraft, the process, and the personnel influencing it." Margaret nodded. "Good. You understand what that implies?" "Yes. Your position may not survive their findings." Margaret met his gaze. "If it shouldn't, it won't." The call ended without ceremony. She sat still for a moment afterward, hands flat on her desk. She thought of her father, of the way he used to say that machines only did what people told them to do, and if something broke, it was rarely the machine's fault. She stood and walked back to the hangar. Daniel was there, standing alone, near the helicopter eyes on the access panel Ethan had left open. He didn't touch it. He just watched. "They're bringing auditors," Margaret said. Daniel nodded. "Then the truth gets heavier. You ready for that?" He glanced at her. "I've been ready longer than you think." She hesitated. "They'll dig into you." Daniel's mouth curved faintly. "They always do eventually." Margaret studied him. "You've been careful about what you say. What you don't." Daniel turned back to the helicopter. "Some stories don't belong to rooms like this. Do they belong to me?" He was quiet for a long moment. The hangar echoed softly around them, the sound of distant work carrying like memory. "I didn't lose my career." "In one moment," he said finally. "I lost it in pieces." Margaret waited. I questioned an upgrade during a training cycle. He continued. New navigation logic. Everyone wanted it deployed fast. It tested clean. On paper. His jaw tightened. I signed off after being told I was holding the unit back. What happened? Margaret asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. The system behaved exactly as designed. The conditions weren't. She felt the weight settle between them. You warned them. Yes. And they ignored you. They heard me, he said. They just trusted the system more than the man. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her voice was steadier. That won't happen here. Daniel met her gaze. Then you'll need more than resolve. She nodded. I know. The external audit team arrived the next day. 3 people. Neutral expressions. Polite questions. They watched everything. They listened more than they spoke. Daniel answered only when asked. He didn't volunteer. He didn't perform. One of them, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, lingered near the helicopter longer than the others. You've flown machines like this, she said quietly to Daniel. Yes, he replied. Not recently. No. She studied him. Experience ages differently than credentials. Daniel didn't argue. The auditors asked Margaret to walk them through the decision chain. She didn't soften it. She didn't redirect blame. When they asked about Daniel's influence, she spoke plainly. He saw a risk we were incentivized to overlook, she said. I listened. The woman nodded once. That's rare. The days that followed blurred into tension and waiting. Engineers worked late, revising code, rerunning tests. Paul Granger avoided Daniel entirely now, speaking through intermediaries, his frustration simmering under forced professionalism. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the hangar in amber light, Paul cornered Margaret near the elevators. You're letting him rewrite this company, he said. Margaret met his stare. I'm letting him save it. Paul scoffed. From what? A hypothetical from certainty, disguised as confidence. Paul's jaw tightened. You think the board will thank you for this? Margaret shrugged. I don't need thanks. She stepped into the elevator and let the doors close. That night, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with Emily. Again, her homework spread out between them. She looked up from a page of fractions. You look tired, she said. So do you, he replied. She smiled. I'm growing. So am I, he said. She studied him. You're not hiding as much. Daniel considered that. Maybe I'm done. Emily nodded, as if that settled something. Good. The audit report landed 2 days later. Margaret read it alone in her office hut, steady breath measured. It was thorough, fair, uncomfortable. It validated the risk Daniel had identified. It criticized the original timeline. It recommended changes. It did not recommend her removal. She exhaled slowly and smiled for the first time in days. The board's response came hours later. Short, formal, reluctant. Proceed with revisions. Maintain oversight. Reassess leadership after launch. Margaret closed the email and stood. She found Daniel in the hangar, hands in his pockets, watching the helicopter like it might finally move. They agreed she said. Daniel nodded. For now. They didn't mention you. They won't, he replied. Not until it's convenient. Margaret studied him. You're still invisible to them. Daniel smiled faintly. That's fine. She looked at the helicopter, then back at him. When this flies, she said it'll be because of you. Daniel shook his head. It'll be because you listened. The lights hummed. The machine waited. And for the first time since the story began, the pressure shifted. Not gone, just redirected toward something that felt less like collapse and more like reckoning. The helicopter rolled onto the runway just after dawn. Not dramatically. No fanfare. Just the low growl of a machine being moved by people who understood weight and consequence. Fog clung to the ground in thin, reluctant sheets, the Texas morning cool enough to bite through jackets. The kind of weather that made pilots honest. Margaret Collins stood at the edge of the tarmac, hands tucked into her coat pockets, watching the crew work. Every motion felt deliberate now, slower, more careful. The revisions had changed the aircraft's behavior on paper. Today would tell them whether it had changed the truth. Daniel Harris stood a few steps behind her, close enough to hear the rotor blades whisper as they turned for the first time. He wasn't wearing a headset. He wasn't part of the flight crew. Officially, he was just observing. That suited him. Ethan Morales approached, tablet tucked against his chest. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, but focused. All systems are green, he said. We've run the revised loop through every scenario we can simulate. Daniel nodded. Simulations are promises, he said. Flight is honesty. Ethan swallowed. You still think it'll hold? I think it'll tell the truth, Daniel replied. That's all anyone can ask. Margaret turned to him. If it doesn't, Daniel met her gaze. Then you were bought early. No heroics, no pride. She held his eyes for a moment, then nodded. Agreed. The pilot arrived quietly, contracted, experienced, mid-40s, no interest in being part of a story. He shook hands, reviewed checklists, climbed into the cockpit with the calm efficiency of someone who trusted procedures because he'd earned that trust the hard way. As the engines spooled up, the sound deepened, vibrating through Margaret's chest. She felt the familiar mix of anticipation and dread coil together. Around them, staff gathered at a careful distance. No one laughed. No one filmed. Paul Granger stood near the perimeter, arms crossed, face unreadable. He hadn't spoken to Daniel in days. He watched the helicopter now like it was a referendum. The aircraft lifted smoothly, skids, clearing the ground with a grace that felt almost understated. It climbed into the fog rotors, slicing through damp air, then banked left, exactly as planned. Margaret exhaled slowly. Minutes passed. Telemetry streamed across monitors. Numbers behaved. No spikes. No lag. Just steady response. Ethan leaned closer to his screen. Jaw-clenched eyes flicking between data points like he didn't trust them yet. Daniel watched the sky. There, he said softly. Margaret turned. What he didn't answer right away. He listened. The sound, the rhythm. They're testing transitions, he said. Aggressive inputs. Good. On the screen, the helicopter dipped, corrected, rolled into a controlled maneuver that made a few people gasp before catching themselves. The revised system responded slower, smoother, human. Paul took a step forward without realizing it. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio. Calm, professional. Response feels predictable. No fight in the controls. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Just a second. Then opened them again. The helicopter descended and touched down without drama. The rotors slowed. The machine settled. For a moment, no one moved. Then the crew erupted into motion, controlled but energized. Ethan let out a breath he'd been holding for days. Someone laughed once, sharp with relief, then stopped almost embarrassed. Margaret felt her knees go weak and forced herself to stay upright. The pilot climbed out and removed his helmet. She's solid, he said. Different than before. Better. Margaret nodded, throat tight. Thank you. Paul approached, eyes still on the aircraft. It worked, he said. Not to anyone in particular. Daniel met his gaze. It listened. Paul's jaw tightened. Don't. Daniel didn't push. He never did. By mid-morning, word had spread beyond the facility. The successful test wasn't public yet, but nothing stayed contained for long. Emails buzzed. Phones rang. Margaret retreated to her office to return calls she'd been avoiding for weeks. The board wanted an update. Regulators wanted confirmation. Investors wanted reassurance wrapped in confidence. She gave them truth. Carefully. Completely. By noon, she was exhausted. She found Daniel in the break area, standing by the window, with a paper cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Outside, the helicopter sat quiet, almost modest now that it had proven itself. They'll want a face, Margaret said. Daniel glanced at her. For what? For the turnaround, she replied. For the story. Daniel shook his head. I'm not it. They'll ask anyway. Then say no. She studied him. You don't want credit? I don't want attention, he corrected. There's a difference. Margaret leaned against the counter. You realize how this looks, don't you? The maintenance contractor who changed the trajectory of a major program. Daniel's mouth curved faintly. Looks aren't my concern. She hesitated. What is, Daniel looked out the window again. Making sure the next decision doesn't undo this one. The afternoon brought visitors. Executives, consultants. A representative from a major emergency services buyer arrived unexpectedly. Eyes, sharp questions pointed. He wanted to know who'd flagged the issue early. Margaret didn't answer immediately. He's not available, she said. The man frowned. You're protecting someone. I'm respecting a boundary, Margaret replied. Daniel watched from a distance as she navigated the conversation with practiced ease. She was good at this. Better than she'd let herself believe. For the first time, he saw her not as a symbol of authority, but as a person choosing how to use it. As the day wound down, Paul approached Daniel near the lockers. His voice was low. You were right, he said. Daniel nodded once. About one thing. Paul's expression tightened. Don't make me say it again. Daniel studied him. You don't have to. Paul hesitated. You're not what I expected. Daniel met his eyes. Neither are you. Paul exhaled and walked away. That evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with Emily again. She listened as he described the test in careful, simple terms, leaving out the parts that still sat heavy in his chest. "So it flew?" she asked. "It did, and it landed?" "Yes." She smiled. "That's good." He watched her for a moment. "You know this means things might change." Emily shrugged. "They always do." He laughed softly. "You're too wise." "I learned from you," she said, and went back to her homework. Later, as night settled over the facility, Margaret stood alone in the hangar. Lights dimmed the helicopter, a dark silhouette against the concrete. Daniel joined her without a word. "We did it," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "We started it." She looked at him. "What happens now?" He met her gaze, eyes steady. "Now they decide what kind of story this is." She nodded. "And what kind of people we are." The hangar hummed softly around them. The machine rested. The truth, at least for tonight, had held. But both of them knew the most dangerous part was still ahead. The story leaked before Margaret Collins could decide how to tell it. It started with a single email forwarded too many times, a line buried in a compliance summary that should have stayed internal. Someone screenshotted it. Someone else added context. By mid-morning, the phrase maintenance contractor had been replaced with something uglier and more clickable. Janitor. The word traveled faster than truth ever did. Margaret saw it when her assistant hovered at the doorway, pale. "You should see this," she said. Margaret didn't look up from her desk right away. She knew that tone. She closed the folder she'd been reading, squared it with the edge of the desk, and nodded. The headline was already spreading across industry feeds. A prototype saved by an unqualified worker. Questions about leadership judgment. Anonymous sources suggesting recklessness disguised as hero worship. The comments were worse. Some sneered. Some mocked. A few dug sharp and curious, sensing a bigger story underneath. Margaret closed the screen. Her pulse was steady. Her jaw wasn't. Across the facility, Daniel Harris learned about it from a security guard who didn't quite meet his eyes. "People are talking," the man said, not unkindly. Daniel nodded. "They always are." By noon, the questions were louder. A reporter called the front desk asking for confirmation. Another showed up at the gate. Phones rang. The communications team, scrambled voices tight, trying to contain a narrative that had already decided to breathe. Margaret called Daniel to her office. He arrived quietly, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed in the way of someone who had learned how to conserve energy for the right moments. "They're coming for you," she said without preamble. Daniel glanced at the window at the parking lot beyond. "They already have. They want your name, your face, your story." Daniel met her gaze. "You're not giving it to them." Margaret hesitated. "Just a beat." "I can't lie. I'm not asking you to. They'll frame this as negligence." Daniel nodded. "They always do when they don't understand restraint." Margaret stood and paced. "I can push back, control the message. But once your past is public, it won't be mine to manage." Daniel's voice was calm. "It never is." She stopped pacing. I won't let them turn you into a spectacle. Daniel looked at her. Really looked. You don't get to protect me from the truth. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. I do if the truth isn't theirs to own. The communications director knocked and entered without waiting. We need a statement, she said. Now. The narrative's turning hostile. Margaret nodded. Give me 10 minutes. When the door closed again, she faced Daniel. I can say you're a consultant. Emphasize process, safety culture. Minimize the rest. Daniel shook his head. That's not honest. It's strategic. It's still a lie, he said gently. And lies always circle back. Margaret exhaled. What do you want? Daniel thought for a moment. I want them to know the machine mattered more than the man. She studied him. They won't like that. I know. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had shifted. All right, she said. We tell the truth. Carefully. Completely. And we accept what comes. The statement went out within the hour. No embellishment, no deflection. It named Daniel Harris as a maintenance contractor with prior experience in aviation safety analysis. It explained the decision chain. It centered accountability. It avoided spectacle. The reaction was immediate. Some applauded the transparency. Others sharpened their knives. A national outlet picked it up and twisted the headline. A local station asked for an interview. Social media did what it always did, collapsing nuance into outrage and praise in equal measure. Daniel went home early that day. Emily met him at the door phone in her hand, eyes wide. Are you famous? She asked. Daniel sighed. No. But people are saying your name. They're saying a lot of things. She frowned. Are you in trouble? He knelt in front of her. No. I'm just being seen. Emily considered that. Is that bad? Sometimes, he said. Sometimes it's just loud. That night, Margaret sat alone in her office, long after the building emptied. She watched the news on mute captions, scrolling beneath faces that spoke with certainty about a story they didn't fully understand. Her phone buzzed with messages from the board, some supportive, some cold. One simply read, "We'll discuss this." She didn't reply. The next morning brought consequences. An emergency board session was scheduled. Not virtual. In person. The kind that left no room for ambiguity. Margaret arrived early. Coffee untouched, spine straight. Daniel was not invited. That was deliberate. Inside the boardroom, the air was tense, polished, unforgiving. Richard Hale sat at the head of the table, hands folded. Others avoided her eyes. This has become a public relations issue, Richard said, without greeting. It became a human one first, Margaret replied. You exposed the company to ridicule. I exposed it to accountability. Richard leaned forward. You elevated a contractor beyond his role. I listened to someone who saw a risk, she said. That's my role. Another board member spoke. The optics are damaging. Margaret met her gaze. So is killing a pilot. Silence. Richard's voice hardened. You're forcing us into a corner. Margaret nodded. Good. Corners reveal priorities. They debated for hours. Policy. Precedent. Risk tolerance. Margaret answered every question without flinching. She didn't invoke Daniel's past. She didn't romanticize. She spoke only to decisions and consequences. When it ended, nothing was resolved. That was the point. Outside, Daniel stood in the hangar watching the helicopter through glass. He felt the weight of attention pressing in from every direction, strangers speculating about his worth, his motives, his right to speak. He breathed through it. Let it pass. Paul Granger approached slower than usual. They're questioning everything now, he said. Daniel nodded. They should have been before. Paul hesitated. You knew this would happen. Yes. And you still stepped forward. Yes. Paul studied him. Why Daniel's gaze didn't leave the aircraft. Because silence is how accidents learn patience. By evening, the tone shifted again. A respected aviation analyst published a thread praising the company's restraint. A former pilot commented about human-centered design. The noise didn't stop, but it changed pitch. Margaret returned to the hangar as dusk settled. Daniel was there, hands resting lightly against the railing eyes on the machine. They didn't fire me, she said. Daniel smiled faintly. Not yet. They want a path forward. Something stable. And I want to finish this right. He nodded. Then don't let them rush you now that it worked once. She looked at him. You're still not taking credit. Daniel shook his head. Credit is a currency that devalues quickly. Margaret laughed softly, more tired than amused. You make it sound simple. It isn't, he said. It's just necessary. They stood in silence as the hangar lights dimmed the helicopter, resting between them like a witness that had already spoken. Outside, the story kept moving, reshaping itself with every retelling. Inside, two people who had chosen restraint over spectacle waited for what came next. Neither of them expected the storm to quiet. They just hoped it would finally tell the truth. The turning point didn't arrive with a headline. It arrived with silence. Margaret Collins noticed it first when her phone stopped buzzing. No alerts, no frantic messages from communications, no new demands from the board, just the quiet hum of the building waking up around her, the soft thud of doors opening, the distant roll of carts on concrete. Silence was never neutral. It meant someone was deciding something. She walked the hangar before anyone else arrived. The helicopter sat where it always had, unchanged, indifferent. Machines didn't anticipate. People did that part for them. Daniel Harris arrived a few minutes later, earlier than usual. Hands empty. No cart. He paused at the threshold, like he always did, scanning the space before stepping into it. Habit. Awareness. Margaret watched him from across the floor and wondered how many years it had taken to move like that without thinking. They've gone quiet, she said as he approached. Daniel nodded. That's when they line up their stories. I think they're deciding whether to use you, she said. Daniel's mouth curved faintly. They already tried to. I mean officially, she replied. As an example. Or a shield. He looked at the helicopter. I won't be either. That may not be your choice. It always is, he said. Just not without cost. By mid-morning, the cost arrived. Paul Granger found them near the observation deck. His tie loosened, eyes ringed with fatigue. The board's here, he said. In person. Not all of them. Enough. Margaret didn't ask which ones. She already knew. They want to see the aircraft, Paul added, and they want to hear from you. Daniel raised an eyebrow. From me? Paul hesitated. They didn't specify how. Margaret exhaled. Of course they didn't. The board members entered the hangar without ceremony. No entourage, no cameras, just polished shoes on concrete and the quiet confidence of people used to being obeyed. Richard Hale led them, expression-neutral eyes sharp. "Show us," he said. The engineers complied. Systems powered up. Data streamed. The revised logic performed exactly as designed. No surprises, no drama, just competence. Richard watched without comment, hands clasped behind his back. When it was done, he turned to Margaret. "It flies," he said. "Yes," she replied. "And it lands." "Yes." He nodded once. "Then explain why we nearly tore ourselves apart getting here." Margaret didn't deflect. "Because we were optimized for speed, not judgment." Richard's gaze shifted to Daniel. "And you?" Daniel met his eyes calmly. "I noticed where judgment had been replaced by comfort." A murmur rippled among the board members. Richard studied Daniel more closely now. "You don't work here." "I do," Daniel replied. "Just not the way you count." "That's the problem," another board member said. "Counting matters." Daniel nodded. "Until it doesn't." Margaret felt the tension spike. She stepped in. "He's not asking for authority. He's asking for attention to consequence." Richard held up a hand. "Let him speak." Daniel didn't thank him. He didn't posture. He simply spoke. "You're asking why this felt chaotic," he said. "It's because you mistook agreement for alignment. People complied because they were rewarded for speed. No one was rewarded for hesitation." A board member scoffed. "Hesitation kills progress." Daniel's voice stayed even. "So does certainty." Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Richard exhaled slowly. "You've been in situations where certainty failed you." "Yes." "And you think this company is on that path?" "I think it was," Daniel said. "I think it changed." Margaret watched Richard's face carefully. The man wasn't angry. He was calculating. That was worse. "And you," Richard said to Margaret, "were willing to risk your position on this." "Yes." "Why?" She didn't hesitate. "Because leadership that only protects itself isn't leadership. It's delay." Richard studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Very well." The board members gathered their things and left as quietly as they'd arrived. No verdict, no announcement, just absence. By afternoon, rumors swirled again, different this time. Not scandal, strategy. Whispers of a restructured safety division. Talk of a new oversight role. Names floated. Daniel's name surfaced, then sank, then surfaced again. Margaret found him near the hangar doors, watching rain begin to spot the concrete outside. "They're circling you," she said. Daniel didn't turn. "They're circling the idea of me." "They want you formalized," she said. "Credentialed, visible, and controlled," he replied. She hesitated. "They're offering you a position." Daniel looked at her then. You're asking, not telling. Yes. What kind of position? Advisory. Safety and human factors. Limited authority. High accountability. Daniel considered. And when I say no, Margaret met his gaze. Then they'll find someone else to be the story. He nodded. That's what I thought. They stood in silence as the rain thickened, drumming against the roof. The hangar felt smaller in the sound, more intimate. I didn't step forward to be absorbed, Daniel said finally. I stepped forward to stop something. Margaret nodded. I know. And if I accept this, he continued, they'll expect me to stop speaking when it's inconvenient. She didn't argue. They will. He watched the rain. I won't. Margaret's chest tightened. Then say no. Daniel shook his head. Then I'd be silent again. And silence is how this started. She looked at him. There's a difference between silence and restraint. He smiled faintly. You're learning. He turned back to the helicopter. If I take this role, it's on my terms. Margaret waited. I don't sign off, he said. I don't approve. I don't carry blame for outcomes I don't control. I speak when something's wrong, and you decide what to do with it. Margaret nodded slowly. They won't like that. They don't have to. She exhaled. I can make that work. Daniel met her eyes. Can you make it stick? She didn't answer immediately. She thought of the board, the headlines, the long game. Then she nodded. Yes. He studied her face, searching for the kind of conviction that didn't fade under pressure. Whatever he saw there satisfied him. Then I'll consider it, he said. That evening, Daniel sat with Emily as she worked through a science project, the kitchen table cluttered with paper and glue. She looked up suddenly. Are you going to get a new job? Maybe, he said. Will you still come home on time? Yes. She nodded, satisfied. Then it's fine, he smiled. Children understood priorities, adults complicated. Back at the facility, Margaret stood alone in the hangar one last time before locking up. She looked at the helicopter, at the machine that had forced her to choose between comfort and consequence. Her phone buzzed. A message from the board. Short, measured, acceptable terms, conditional approval. She closed her eyes and breathed. Somewhere between pressure and principle, something had shifted. Not resolved, not clean, but real. The story hadn't ended. It had simply chosen a direction, and this time it wasn't running from the truth. The morning of the public demonstration arrived without drama, which felt almost wrong. No banners, no countdown clock, no music. Just a line of parked cars, stretching farther than usual, and a crowd that kept its distance, as if instinctively aware this was not a spectacle meant to be rushed. The air was cool, clean, carrying the faint smell of fuel and dew-soaked concrete. The helicopter waited at the center of it all, unchanged, unbranded quiet, in a way that commanded attention. Margaret Collins stood near the edge of the tarmac, hands clasped behind her back, posture composed but not rigid. She wore a simple jacket, no statement pieces, no armor. The board members had arrived earlier, their presence subtle but unmistakable eyes, tracking movement, calculating optics. Regulators stood nearby, not adversarial, just watchful. Engineers clustered together, murmuring in low voices, the sound of nerves disguised as professionalism. Daniel Harris stood farther back where shadows softened faces and expectations thinned. No badge, no title pinned to his chest. Just a man who had agreed to be seen enough to matter and no more. The pilot walked the perimeter of the aircraft, methodical, thorough. Checklists clicked through muscle memory. The machine responded the way it was meant to, now patient, honest. Margaret watched every step, aware that this moment carried more weight than any meeting she had ever chaired. When the engine started, the sound rolled across the tarmac like a held breath finally released. The rotors cut the air cleanly rhythm, steady, controlled. No rush, no show, just function. The helicopter lifted. It rose smoothly, almost modestly, as if aware that this flight was not about proving power, but restraint. It climbed, banked, transitioned through maneuvers, designed not to impress but to reveal. The data flowed. The monitors held. The engineers leaned forward, eyes wide, not in fear, but recognition. Daniel watched the sky, not the screens. He listened. He always had. The pilot's voice came through the radio, calm, precise. Confirmation after confirmation. The aircraft responded the way a machine should when it respected the person guiding it. No fight, no lag, no quiet betrayal hidden behind perfection. When it landed, the sound was almost anticlimactic. Skids kissed the ground. Rotors slowed. Silence followed, deep and complete. Then came the exhale. Margaret felt it move through the crowd like a wave. Relief, pride, something like humility. She didn't raise her arms. She didn't smile widely. She simply nodded once to no one in particular. The board members approached her first, not with congratulations but acknowledgement. Subtle shifts in posture, measured words. One of them, Richard Hale, paused longer than the others. "You were right to slow it down," he said. Margaret met his gaze. "I was right to listen." He nodded and walked away. The regulators followed, satisfied, their questions answered before they had to be asked. The engineers gathered near the aircraft, some touching its frame lightly as if grounding themselves after weeks of tension. Ethan Morales found Daniel near the edge of the crowd. He hesitated, then spoke. "Thank you," he said. Not loudly, not formally, for not letting us rush past something we didn't want to see. Daniel nodded. "You did the work." Ethan shook his head. "We finished it." Paul Granger approached last. He looked older than he had weeks ago, but steadier too. "I didn't like how this started," he said, "but I respect how it ended." Daniel met his eyes. "Endings are overrated." Paul allowed a small smile and walked away. Margaret found Daniel as the crowd began to thin the air, warming as the sun climbed. "They're announcing the new safety division this afternoon," she said. "Your role, the boundaries, everything you asked for." Daniel nodded. "Then make sure they mean it." "I will." She hesitated, then extended her hand. He took it. The handshake was firm, brief, unceremonious. "Exactly right." "I won't thank you," she said. "I wouldn't trust you if you did," he replied. They stood together for a moment, watching the helicopter as crews moved in to secure it, to prepare it for whatever came next. The machine had done its part. Now people would decide what to learn from it. That evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with Emily. The window opened to let in the fading warmth of the day. She looked up from her book. Did it fly? It did. And land. Yes. She smiled, satisfied. Good. He watched her for a moment. Things might be different now. She shrugged. They always are. He smiled, softer than before. Back at the facility, Margaret stood alone in the hangar one last time before the lights dimmed. She looked at the helicopter, at the space it occupied, at the quiet it left behind. She thought about leadership, about restraint, about the cost of listening when it would be easier not to. She turned off the lights and walked away. Somewhere beyond the hangar doors, the world would keep telling the story its own way. Some would frame it as luck, others as controversy. A few might understand it for what it was, a moment where speed stepped aside for judgment and power learned to listen. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment. 3 simple words. Respect earns trust.